Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the path to the Enlightenment period, basically from about year zero to about the 1300s. Now, what is the Enlightenment exactly? Well, its peak is around the 1700s, like the creation of the United States is a direct impact from the Enlightenment. It's when people start to use reason, science, individualism, humanity to improve society. It's when people stopped thinking old school and started thinking more modern, how we would think today. So, like old school would be tradition or religion solves all kinds of problems. But the Enlightenment made it so humans solve problems using logic and science. Old school is truth exists because someone tells you it's true, whether it's a church or a king. But later on, after the Enlightenment, we find that truth exists because factual evidence finds it to be actually true. Old school is people need to be ruled over. They're simpletons and they need to be ruled over by a higher power. And after the Enlightenment, the idea came about that people actually need a say in government or even just rule themselves. Old school thought God actually rules over all aspects of your life and is kind of looking down on you and maneuvering you. The Enlightenment, after the Enlightenment, people are free to practice religion that fits their own vision. I mean, even the people that founded the colony, yeah, they were Christians, but they were deists, and they were people that believed that God was too busy to deal with like humanity's every waking move. And then old school is that people are born as subjects or in a predetermined class. Where you were born is where you were going to stay. The Enlightenment was different. After the Enlightenment, the idea of that people are born free, that God gave people liberty as a part of their birth, that comes out of the Enlightenment. So let's talk about a couple of things that lead up to the Enlightenment. Remember that we're dealing with now zero being the birth of Jesus Christ, and then we're going forward, and we're going to go to about the 1300s. So we remember last time we left off with the religions. The Jews, of course, spread throughout all of Europe, parts of North Africa. You are not going to see the Jews again until the 1930s. They are spend most of the time in Europe being oppressed by other different ethnicities and countries. Islam starts in Mecca and spreads rapidly around 600 all throughout North Africa and the Middle East. It is extremely popular and has a lot of followers. We're going to kind of back off of Islam for a little while until we get into more World War One, which is the early 1900s. The one we are going to focus on is Christianity. Of course, Christianity after Christ dies and Rome goes on purges in Israel. Christianity starts to spread massively throughout not only the Mediterranean, but also up here in Europe. And that's kind of where the backdrop of what's going to happen over the next 1,000 years is the fact that Christianity is super, super popular. The idea of forgiveness and atonement and love thy neighbor, big time popularity. And this is actually Rome. This is the most Rome spreads, the Roman Empire in the year 117. Okay. Why is this important? Because Rome ends up being the most powerful empire on earth. Rome is the world's biggest city during this time period. And of course, as we know, eventually Rome is not going to last forever. Around 312, you have the first Christian Roman Empire. And around 376, Christianity actually becomes the official religion of Rome. But eventually, Rome actually falls. Okay. And around the year 500, the Roman Empire becomes something else. And when people talk about empires falling, it's like, oh, it's a massive collapse. But in this case, it's a little bit different. The Roman Empire kind of falls, but it evolves into something else. And that something else is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church now takes power, not like a Roman emperor or Caesar. And so the most powerful person in Europe is now going to be the Pope. And so what we have is these, we have the Holy Roman Empire. You have what eventually will become countries. We have the Byzantine Empire. All these are different empires, but they all fall under the umbrella of the Catholic Church. So, yes, and there will be fighting and violence and that kind of thing, but over everything else is actually the Catholic faith. And the Vatican, which is located in the city of Rome, Vatican City, the Vatican is the home of the Catholic Church and the Pope, and that's where all power actually and influence emanates from. What this does is, for the time period pretty much when the Rome falls all the way up until around 1400, is create a social group known as or social system known as feudalism. And feudalism is that you have a social hierarchy, meaning that there's a ranking. At the very top is going to be the Catholic Church and the Pope, then kings, nobles, knights and vassals, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and serfs and peasants at the very bottom. And once you're born into these groups, it's almost impossible to move in between those groups. And those above you have more power than those below you, and the people below you will work for you. And of course, the land is primarily owned by the church, the kings, and the nobles. The knights and the vassals protect the land. The merchants, farmers, craftsmen might work on the land, and then the peasants and serfs are slaves to the land. So this system is going to exist for, again, many hundreds of years. And the church is basically telling people how to think based on faith. And of course, they wrote the Bible, which is this, the Old Testament, which is the Torah, and then the New Testament, which is the Gospels, talking about Jesus' life. They wrote it in Latin, and they wrote it intentionally so people couldn't actually read it, and it would be interpreted by members of the church, keeping people kind of ignorant. So then we mix in another event that takes place, and that is the Black Death. The Black Death is a plague that starts in East Asia, moves across the Middle East into Europe, occurs around 1346, 1353. It ended up killing around 200 million people when you count everybody in India, current day China, Middle East, Egypt, and Europe. About 30 to 50% of Europe's population is dead. What this does, though, is it creates a demand for labor, because a lot of people that were like nobles and people that worked on the land are actually passed on. People with greater mobility and skills are more desired. And so now people are saying, like, I will work for pay, I'm not going to work for free. And it's the beginning of the end of that whole social hierarchy, the beginning of the end of feudalism, because you're starting to get a working class that's going to work for pay. All right. So we often consider of course, the Black Death is probably the worst plague ever to hit the world, but it did end kind of a tied to the land social system, and it created actual markets for labor. All right. And then the group that actually became wealthier fastest stopped being the nobles, because a lot of nobles died and they were tied to their land. Instead, merchants were becoming much wealthier much quicker. Okay. And this creates a time period known as the Renaissance, because that wealth actually ends up being tied to one area of the world in particular, and that is northern Italy, the cities of Genoa, Venice, and Florence. A lot of the super wealthy traders come from these areas. They trade all throughout the Mediterranean. So they get up there to the Baltics, to where Russia is. They go to the Middle East and get stuff that no one's ever really seen or been exposed to before. They also go all the way up to England. And so the trade creates an enormous amount of money. And so they start getting into things like art and architecture. And the Renaissance is a time when there's a rebirth into loving art, loving the ideas of the Greeks and the Romans. And so you start seeing fantastic works of art by famous artists like Leonardo da Vinci. We have the Mona Lisa. Michelangelo paints the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Each one of these is a ceiling of an enormous chapel. Each one of these being a part of the Bible. The most famous one is the one right there in the middle. That's the creation of Adam and God. Michelangelo's portrait of David, the statue. You have the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. Most people don't look at this, but most people have seen the little cherubs at the bottom. The Last Summer by Da Vinci, and Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. So all of a sudden, there's this real super interest in art. And this, drives people's passions toward, art could be really, really awesome, and the knowledge could be really, really awesome. But the church is still in the way. And so this leads to our last thing that leads to the Enlightenment, and that is the Protestant Reformation. So a man named Martin Luther, who is a member of the church, gets really alienated with the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church, needing money, says, you can have your sins forgiven if you just give us cash. And those are called indulgences. And Martin Luther is like, this is an embarrassment. This is a travesty. Basically, the Catholic Church is corrupt, trying to exchange money for forgiveness from God. So he nails a group of grievances called the 95 Theses onto the door of a chapel, and it kicks off, and he goes into hiding and starts rewriting the Bible, and not writing the Bible in Latin, but rewriting it in German and other languages. But he's using a new invention to mass produce it that is called the printing press. And now people actually have exposure to the Bible interpreted in a different way than the Catholic Church. And that creates different religions. And the Protestant Reformation is when the one unified Catholic Church breaks apart and becomes three new churches with three new interpretations of how the Bible actually comes about. And what this does in the long run is you have the division of the religions. Here's the Reformation, where you have all these are the Protestant religions. You have the Adventists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, Lutherans, and of course, eventually the Anglican Church breaks away. And then if you're a Methodist, you came from the English Church. And of course, the Catholics and the Orthodox Church, it still exists. And of course, Jews also. But big time now, the church is not the dominant vision going forward. All these things, well, of course, around the world, Catholics still represent about half the faith, but you also have Protestants and different independents also. All these things lead to this new thing called the Enlightenment, where people use reason, science, individualism to improve the social order. So you got the church doing the influence after the fall of Rome. You have feudalism that gets broken apart by the Black Death, that leads to a very rich and interesting time of ideas called the Renaissance. Martin Luther cracks the church, and then we go to Enlightenment.